The explosion throws dirt into Elena's face as bullets whistle overhead. Her squad sprints toward the extraction point, but her combat boots slip on loose rocks again. "Move your ass, Vasquez!" Sergeant Morrison screams, but she's already 20 yards behind. When the enemy flanks them from the ridge, Morrison's eyes meet hers for one cold second. "Sorry, kid." The helicopter's rotors thunder as her squad boards without her. Elena watches the aircraft disappear, enemy voices growing closer. She's alone in hostile territory with a broken radio, limited ammo, and the crushing realization that her own team just signed her death warrant. The morning had started like any other mission briefing. Elena sat in the back row of the cramped tent, her notebook balanced on her knee as Colonel Hayes outlined their objective. Intelligence suggested General Harrison had been captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. His location: a fortified compound 12 miles into enemy territory. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate, extract, exfiltrate. In practice, it would require speed, precision, and flawless coordination. "Vasquez," Morrison had called out after the briefing, his voice carrying that familiar edge of irritation. "Try to keep up today. We can't afford any of your usual delays." Elena's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She'd heard variations of this speech countless times over the past 6 months. Too slow on the obstacle course. Too cautious during urban warfare training. Too methodical when split-second decisions were required. The other soldiers had started calling her Turtle behind her back, though they were careful never to say it when she could prove them wrong on the shooting range or during medical drills. The helicopter ride to the drop zone had been tense. Elena checked her gear for the 3rd time: medical kit, ammunition, emergency rations, water purification tablets. She caught Private Chun watching her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Even the newest recruit had absorbed the squad's collective opinion of her capabilities. "You know," Chun had shouted over the rotor noise, "maybe you should consider transferring to a support role. Logistics or something." Elena had simply adjusted her pack straps and stared out the window at the hostile landscape below. She'd worked twice as hard as anyone else to earn her place in this unit, but somehow her efforts only seemed to reinforce their perception of her as a liability. The drop had gone smoothly. They'd landed in a clearing 2 miles from the compound, using the pre-dawn darkness as cover. Elena had actually kept pace during the initial approach, a shorter stride compensated by her superior knowledge of the terrain. She'd studied the satellite imagery for hours, memorizing every ridge, every potential ambush point, every escape route. But as they'd moved closer to the target, the pace had increased. Morrison pushed them harder, driven by intelligence reports suggesting enemy reinforcements were en route. Elena's pack, loaded with extra medical supplies at her own insistence, began to feel like an anchor. Her breathing grew labored as they climbed a steep ravine, and the gap between her and the rest of the squad widened with each step. "Vasquez, close it up." Morrison had hissed through the comm, but his voice carried more frustration than encouragement. She'd pushed harder, her lungs burning, sweat stinging her eyes despite the cool morning air. But physics was unforgiving. Her legs were simply shorter, her frame smaller, and the additional weight she carried in medical supplies that could save lives, slowed her down just enough to matter. The compound assault had been textbook perfect, at least initially. Elena had watched from her position 50 yards behind as her squad mates breached the perimeter with surgical precision. She'd been closing the distance, finally finding her rhythm. When the first explosion had rocked the building, that's when everything went wrong. Enemy reinforcements had arrived earlier than expected, flanking them from the eastern ridge. The careful plan dissolved into chaos as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. Elena had thrown herself behind a boulder, her heart hammering as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. Through her scope, She'd watched Morrison make rapid tactical decisions, hand signals flying as he repositioned the squad. They were good, she had to admit that. Even under fire, they moved with the fluid coordination that came from months of training together. Training she'd been part of, but somehow never quite integrated into. The extraction helicopter had appeared right on schedule, its rotors beating against the morning sky like mechanical thunder. Elena had started to move, knowing she needed to cover the remaining distance quickly. But her position was exposed, and enemy fire forced her to take cover again. She'd keyed her radio, trying to coordinate with Morrison, but only static answered. The device had been damaged during her dive for cover, its screen cracked and dark. She was cut off, isolated, watching her squad prepare for extraction while she remained pinned, down by enemy fire. That's when she'd seen Morrison's face through her scope. He was looking directly at her position, his expression calculating. She could almost see the tactical assessment playing out in his mind. One soldier, separated from the group, under heavy fire, slowing down the entire operation. The helicopter couldn't wait indefinitely. Enemy reinforcements were closing in. Elena had waved frantically, signaling that she was mobile, that she could make it if they just gave her 30 more seconds. But Morrison had already turned away. His decision made. "Sorry, kid," he mouthed. Though she couldn't hear the words over the gunfire and rotor noise. The helicopter had lifted off with her squad aboard, leaving Elena alone on the hostile mountainside. She'd watched it disappear over the ridge, carrying her teammates to safety while she remained behind, abandoned by the very people she'd trained with, fought alongside, and trusted with her life. The enemy voices were getting closer now, coordinated search patterns closing in on her position. Elena checked her ammunition, 2 full magazines plus the one in her weapon. Not much for a prolonged firefight. Her water was adequate for maybe 2 days if she rationed carefully. Food for the same period. But it was the psychological impact that hit hardest. The crushing realization that when the moment of truth arrived, her own squad had written her off as expendable. All those months of proving herself, of working harder than anyone else, of volunteering for extra training and dangerous assignments, none of it had mattered when Morrison made his cold calculation. Elena forced herself to focus on immediate survival. The enemy search pattern suggested they knew approximately where she was, but hadn't pinpointed her exact location. She had maybe 10 minutes before they found her hiding spot behind the boulder cluster. Moving carefully, she began to work her way deeper into the rocky terrain, using every piece of cover available. Her slowness during training had taught her to be methodical, to think 3 moves ahead, to notice details that others missed in their rush to complete objectives. Now, ironically, those same qualities might be what kept her alive. As she moved through the shadows, Elena made herself a promise. If she survived this, when she survived this, she would prove to Morrison and the rest of them exactly what they had thrown away. She would show them that being thorough wasn't the same as being slow, and that sometimes the person they left behind was the one they needed most. The enemy voices echoed off the rocks behind her, growing more distant as she put space between herself and her last known position. Elena Vasquez was on her own now, but she was far from finished. Elena's heart pounds as she crawls through the bombed-out building, following weak groans echoing from the basement. Behind a collapsed wall, she finds General Harrison, the man her squad was sent to rescue, unconscious and bleeding out from a massive head wound. Her hands shake as she checks his pulse. He's alive, but barely. The bitter irony hits her. While her squad reported mission failure and flew home, the general they abandoned is dying 3 feet from where they gave up looking. Enemy boots echo above as Elena tears her shirt into bandages. Knowing that saving him means certain death for both of them, the groaning had been so faint that Elena almost missed it beneath the sound of her own labored breathing. She'd been moving through the compound's ruins for 20 minutes, using the maze of collapsed walls and debris as cover while enemy patrols swept the area above. Her tactical training told her to keep moving, to put distance between herself and the search teams. But something about that sound made her pause. It came again, a low, pained moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Elena pressed her ear to the ground, trying to locate the source. The compound's main building had taken a direct hit during the assault, its 3 stories pancaked into a twisted mass of concrete and steel. But beneath the rubble, she could make out the outline of what had once been a basement entrance. Elena's medical training kicked in automatically. Someone was alive down there, and from the sound of it, they were in serious trouble. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to focus on her own survival. But she couldn't walk away from someone who might be dying, just yards from where she crouched. The basement access was partially blocked by a fallen beam, but Elena managed to squeeze through the gap. Her flashlight beam cut through the dusty darkness, revealing a scene of devastation. The basement had served as some kind of command center. Banks of destroyed communications equipment lined the walls, and scattered papers covered the floor like fallen leaves. That's when she saw him. General Marcus Harrison lay pinned beneath a section of collapsed ceiling, his dress uniform torn and bloodied. Elena recognized him immediately from the mission briefings. The weathered face, the distinctive gray mustache, the bearing that commanded respect even in unconsciousness. But the man before her was a far cry from the confident officer in the intelligence photos. Blood matted his silver hair, flowing from a gash that ran from his left temple to behind his ear. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and when Elena checked his pulse, she found it weak and thready. A quick assessment revealed multiple injuries: the head wound, possible internal bleeding, and his left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath the debris. "Jesus," Elena whispered, her hands already moving to assess the damage. "What the hell happened to you?" As she worked, the pieces began to fall into place. The intelligence had been wrong or deliberately misleading. General Harrison hadn't been captured and taken to some remote location. He'd been here all along, trapped in this basement command center when the building came down during the initial assault. Elena's mind raced as she processed the implications. Her squad had spent precious minutes searching the upper floors and surrounding buildings, following protocols based on faulty intelligence. They'd been looking for a prisoner when they should have been conducting a rescue operation. And when the enemy counterattack forced them to abort, they'd left believing the general was already dead or beyond their reach. The bitter irony was almost overwhelming. While Morrison and the others were flying back to base, preparing to report mission failure, the man they'd been sent to save was dying just feet from where they'd given up their search. Elena, the soldier they deemed too slow and unreliable to extract with them, was now the general's only hope for survival. Enemy voices echoed from the floor above, speaking in rapid, urgent tones. Elena could make out enough of the language to understand they were conducting a systematic search, room by room, floor by floor. It was only a matter of time before they found the basement entrance. Working quickly, Elena began tearing strips from her undershirt to create makeshift bandages. The head wound was her primary concern. It was bleeding heavily, and she suspected a skull fracture. She applied direct pressure, watching as the white fabric quickly turned crimson. "Come on, General," she whispered, checking his pupils with her flashlight. "Stay with me here." His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak groan before losing consciousness again. Elena continued her assessment, noting signs of a possible concussion and internal injuries that were beyond her ability to treat in the field. The sound of boots on the floor above grew louder, more systematic. Elena realized they had maybe 5 minutes before the search reached the basement. She faced an impossible choice: attempt to move the general and risk killing him, or stay and fight a battle she couldn't win. As she worked to stabilize his condition, Elena's mind wandered to the cruel mathematics of military decision-making. Morrison had made his choice based on incomplete information and time. Pressure standard operating procedure when lives were at stake. But those same protocols had led to this moment, where the mission's primary objective lay dying in a basement while the rescue team flew home. Empty-handed, Elena checked the general's leg, confirming her suspicion of a compound fracture. Moving him would be agony, assuming he survived the process at all. But staying meant certain capture or death for both of them. The enemy soldiers above weren't likely to take prisoners, especially not after the casualties inflicted during the assault. She began the delicate process of freeing the general from the debris, using a piece of rebar as a lever to lift the concrete slab pinning his leg. Each movement brought fresh blood from his wounds, and she had to pause twice when his breathing became dangerously shallow. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she worked. "I know this hurts, but I have to get you out of here." The general's eyes opened again, this time focusing on her face with obvious effort. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't quite hear. Elena leaned closer, straining to understand. "My men?" he managed to whisper. Elena's throat tightened. She didn't know how to tell him that his rescue team had already left, that they'd been written off as casualties. Instead, she focused on applying a splint to his leg using pieces of debris and torn fabric. "We're going to get you out of here, sir," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by voices calling out in the enemy's language. Elena caught fragments, orders to check the basement, reports of blood trails, commands to take any survivors alive for interrogation. Elena finished her field treatment and began planning their escape route. The basement had a second exit on the far side, partially concealed by fallen equipment. It would mean carrying the general across 30 feet of open space, but it was their only chance. As she prepared to move him, Elena couldn't help but think about Morrison's words. "Sorry, kid." The apology that had stung so deeply just an hour ago now seemed prophetic. Because if she was right about their chances of survival, sorry was exactly what everyone was going to be. The general's hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong despite his injuries. When she looked down, his eyes were clear and focused. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked quietly. "Private Elena Vasquez, sir." He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Well, Private Vasquez, it looks like you're all I've got." Elena squeezed his hand gently. "Then we'd better make it count, sir." Elena's shoulders scream in agony as she drags the general's dead weight through the mud. Every 50 yards, she stops to check his breathing, her own lungs burning. Searchlights sweep the forest as enemy patrols close in. When the general's eyes flutter open, he whispers, "Leave me." Elena's response is to hoist him higher on her back. She navigates by memory through terrain her squad rushed past, using every shadow and ravine she memorized while slowing them down. Her legs give out twice, but each time she forces herself up, driven by rage at being abandoned and determination to prove them all wrong. The makeshift stretcher had lasted exactly 47 minutes before the parachute cord snapped on a jagged rock. Elena had fashioned it from debris and torn fabric, but the general's weight combined with the rough terrain proved too much for her improvised engineering. Now she carried him the old-fashioned way, his arm draped over her shoulders, his dead weight threatening to topple them both with every unsteady step. "Private," General Harrison wheezed, his voice barely audible over the sound of distant helicopters. "This is suicide. Leave me and save yourself." Elena adjusted her grip, feeling fresh blood seep through the bandages on his head wound. "With respect, sir, shut up and conserve your strength." The general might have smiled if he'd had the energy. Instead, He focused on staying conscious as Elena half-carried, half-dragged him through the dense undergrowth. Behind them, the enemy search was intensifying. Helicopter rotors chopped through the night air, and the sweep of searchlights created moving patches of harsh white light that Elena had to constantly avoid. She'd been moving for 3 hours now, covering what she estimated to be roughly 2 miles of the 8-mile journey back to base. At this rate, they'd never make it before dawn, and daylight would make concealment impossible. But Elena had advantages her squad hadn't possessed during their rapid advance time to think, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the desperate motivation of someone with nothing left to lose. During those training exercises where she'd fallen behind, Elena had developed a habit of studying the landscape around her. While the others focused on speed and efficiency, she'd memorized alternate routes, noted potential hiding spots, and identified natural landmarks that could serve as navigation aids. Her squadmates had mocked her methodical approach, but now that attention to detail was keeping them both alive. "There's a creek bed about 200 meters northeast," she whispered to the general as they paused behind a cluster of boulders. "It'll give us cover and muffle our movement." Harrison nodded weakly, his face pale in the moonlight. Elena could see he was fighting to stay conscious, his military training warring with his body's desperate need to shut down and heal. She checked his pulse, still weak but steady, and gave him a sip of water from her canteen. The creek bed proved to be exactly where Elena remembered it. A natural depression carved by decades of seasonal flooding. The water was only ankle deep, but the banks provided excellent concealment from aerial observation. Elena helped the general down into the stream, wincing as he suppressed a groan of pain. "How do you know this terrain so well?" he asked as they began moving downstream. "I was the slow one," Elena replied, her voice bitter. "While everyone else was racing ahead, I was taking notes." They moved in silence for the next hour, Elena supporting most of the general's weight as they navigated the rocky stream. The water was ice cold, and she could feel the general shivering against her, his body temperature dropping dangerously low. She needed to get him warm and dry soon, but stopping meant risking capture. The sound of voices ahead made Elena freeze. She pressed the general against the creek bank, both of them crouching in the shallow water as an enemy patrol passed overhead. Elena counted at least 6 soldiers, their flashlight beams sweeping the forest floor just yards from their hiding spot. "They're using dogs," the general whispered, his training allowing him to identify the tactical situation despite his injuries. Elena had noticed the same thing. The distinctive sound of tracking animals was getting closer, and the creek water would only mask their scent for so long. She made a quick decision, helping the general up the far bank and into a dense thicket of thorny undergrowth. "This is going to hurt," she warned, then began pushing through the brambles. The thorns tore at their clothing and skin, but the thick vegetation provided perfect concealment. Elena could hear the patrol dogs whining in confusion as they lost the scent trail at the creek's edge. The handlers spent 20 minutes searching the area before moving on, their voices fading into the distance. Elena's legs gave out for the first time as they emerged from the thicket. The combination of exhaustion, adrenaline crash, and the general's weight finally overwhelmed her, and she collapsed to her knees in a small clearing. The general rolled off her back, landing hard on the forest floor. "I'm sorry," Elena gasped, her chest heaving. "I just need a minute." "Take 5, the general replied, though his voice was growing weaker. "You're doing incredible work, Private." Elena forced herself to stand, knowing that stopping for too long would make it impossible to start again. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire, and her legs trembled with each step. But the alternative was unthinkable. She'd already been abandoned once tonight. She wasn't going to abandon someone else. The second collapse came 2 hours later, just as they reached the halfway point of their journey. This time, Elena's legs simply buckled without warning, sending both soldiers tumbling down a small embankment. The general cried out as his injured leg struck a rock, fresh blood soaking through the makeshift splint. "I can't," Elena whispered, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I'm not strong enough." General Harrison reached out with his good arm, grasping her shoulder with surprising strength. "Look at me, Private." Elena met his eyes, seeing something there that hadn't been present before, not just respect, but genuine admiration. "In 30 years of military service," he said quietly, "I have never seen a soldier show more courage or determination than you've shown tonight. Your squad made a tactical decision based on incomplete information. But you're making a choice based on something deeper." "They left me behind because I was too slow," Elena said, the words tasting bitter. "No," the general replied firmly. "They left behind the one person who could save my life. The one person who knew this terrain well enough to get us home. The one person stubborn enough to carry a wounded general 8 miles through enemy territory." Elena wiped her eyes and struggled to her feet. The general was right. This wasn't about proving anything to Morrison or the others anymore. This was about doing what was right, regardless of the cost. She helped the general to his feet, noting that his condition was deteriorating. His breathing was more labored, and she suspected internal bleeding was getting worse. They had maybe 4 hours before his injuries became fatal, and they still had 4 miles to cover. "Ready for another mile, sir?" Elena asked, positioning herself to take his weight again. "Lead the way, Private," Harrison replied. "I'm not going anywhere without you." As they resumed their painful journey through the darkness, Elena found herself thinking about Morrison's decision to leave her behind. At the time, it had felt like the ultimate betrayal. Now, she realized it might have been the best thing that ever happened to her and to General Harrison. Sometimes being left behind meant being exactly where you needed to be. The base guards nearly shoot Elena as she stumbles out of the darkness. The general's unconscious form strapped to her back with torn parachute cord. Her uniform is soaked in blood, his and hers. In the medical tent, as doctors work frantically on the general, he grabs Elena's wrist with surprising strength. "This soldier," he gasps to the gathering crowd, "carried me 8 miles through enemy lines." Sergeant Morrison pushes through the crowd, his face pale. The general's next words cut through the silence like a blade. "After her own squad left us both to die." Morrison's eyes meet Elena's across the tent, and for the first time, she doesn't look away. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when Elena finally saw the familiar outline of Forward, Operating Base Kestrel. The sight should have filled her with relief, but exhaustion had numbed her emotions hours ago. She moved like a machine now, one foot in front of the other. The general's weight a constant reminder of how close they'd both come to dying in that basement. General Harrison had lost consciousness again 20 minutes earlier, his breathing shallow and irregular. Elena could feel his blood soaking through her torn uniform, warm against her back despite the morning chill. She'd stopped checking his pulse. Either he was alive or he wasn't, and stopping to find out would only waste precious time. The perimeter guards spotted her first. Elena watched through blurred vision as 2 soldiers raised their weapons, unsure what to make of the blood-soaked figure emerging from the tree line. She tried to call out, to identify herself, but her voice came out as a hoarse croak. "Friendly," she finally managed, raising one hand while supporting the general with the other. "Medical emergency." The guards lowered their weapons and rushed forward, their faces shifting from suspicion to shock as they recognized her. Private Chun, who'd suggested she transfer to logistics just yesterday, stared at her with his mouth open. "Jesus Christ, Vasquez," he breathed. "We thought you were dead." "Not yet," Elena replied, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline that had sustained her for 8 hours suddenly evaporated. She collapsed to her knees, carefully lowering the general to the ground. "Get the medics," Now, the base erupted into controlled chaos. Medical personnel swarmed around them, checking vitals and barking orders. Elena found herself pushed aside as the trauma team took over. Their practiced efficiency, a stark contrast to her desperate field medicine. She watched them work, noting with professional satisfaction that her improvised bandages and splints had helped throughout the journey. Private Vasquez? A medic was kneeling beside her, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Elena looked down at herself, surprised to see how much blood covered her uniform. Most of it belonged to the general, but she picked up her share of cuts and scrapes during their 8-mile odyssey. Her shoulders felt like they'd been dislocated and reset multiple times, and her legs shook uncontrollably now that she'd finally stopped moving. "I'm fine," she lied, then corrected herself. "I'm functional." The medic didn't look convinced, but before he could argue, a commotion near the medical tent drew their attention. Elena turned to see Sergeant Morrison pushing through the crowd of soldiers that had gathered to witness her return. His face was pale, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Behind him came the rest of her squad chun, Rodriguez, Williams, and Jackson. They looked like they'd seen a ghost, which Elena supposed they had. According to their mission report, she was supposed to be dead, killed in action during the enemy counterattack. "Vasquez," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled. "How did you, Sergeant Morrison?" The voice that interrupted him was weak, but carried unmistakable authority. General Harrison had regained consciousness on the stretcher, his eyes focused despite his injuries. "I need to speak with you." Morrison snapped to attention, his training overriding his confusion. "Yes, sir." "General Harrison, sir. We thought you were dead?" The general's laugh turned into a cough that brought up blood. "I nearly was. Would have been, if not for Private Vasquez here." Elena watched Morrison's face as the implication sank in. The mission hadn't been a failure. The general had been there all along, trapped in the basement they'd searched. And the soldier Morrison had written off as dead weight had somehow managed to extract him single-handedly. "Sir," Morrison began, "the tactical situation required you to abandon a wounded soldier under enemy fire." The general interrupted, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious pain. "I understand tactical necessity, Sergeant, but I also understand what I witnessed in that basement and during our journey back to base." The crowd of soldiers had grown larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a general publicly dressing down a squad leader. Elena could see Colonel Hayes pushing through the crowd, his face grim as he assessed the situation. "This soldier," General Harrison continued, his eyes finding Elena's across the tent, "carried me 8 miles through enemy territory. She treated my wounds with nothing but field supplies and determination. She evaded multiple enemy patrols, navigated hostile terrain in complete darkness, and never once considered leaving me behind." Elena felt the weight of dozens of stares, but for the first time in months, they didn't feel judgmental. The soldiers around her were looking at her with something she'd never seen before: respect. "After her own squad left us both to die," the general added, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade. Morrison's face flushed red, but he maintained his military bearing. "Sir, the decision to abort was based on incomplete intelligence and time pressure," the general finished. "I understand that, Sergeant. What I don't understand is how you failed to recognize the value of the soldier you abandoned." Colonel Hayes had reached the medical tent, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Elena struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her again. "Colonel," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "requesting permission to report mission status." Hayes nodded slowly. "Go ahead, Private." "Mission accomplished, sir." General Harrison extracted and returned to base. "Enemy casualties unknown. Friendly casualties." Elena paused, looking directly at Morrison. "None. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see the calculations running through Morrison's mind, the same tactical assessment that had led him to abandon her 12 hours earlier. But the variables had changed. The soldier he'd written off as a liability had just accomplished what his entire squad had failed to do. General Harrison struggled to sit up on the stretcher, waving off the medics who tried to restrain him. "Colonel Hayes, I want to make an official recommendation." Private Vasquez showed extraordinary courage and competence under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. She deserves recognition for her actions. Elena felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. She'd cried enough in the forest. Now was the time to stand tall. Morrison stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Vasquez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Elena met his eyes, seeing something there she'd never noticed before: uncertainty. For the first time since joining the squad, Morrison looked like he wasn't sure he'd made the right decision. "No, Sergeant," Elena replied, her voice steady. "You made a tactical decision based on the information available. But next time, you might want to consider that sometimes the slowest soldier is the one who notices things everyone else misses." She turned to address the crowd of soldiers watching the exchange. Sometimes being left behind means being exactly where you need to be. As the medics finally succeeded in getting General Harrison onto a proper stretcher, he caught Elena's hand one last time. "Thank you, Private," he said simply, "for not giving up." Elena squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you, sir, for giving me something worth carrying."